This is the first of a two-part series on legislation and service delivery for adults. This is part one, and in part one, I intend to talk about the early legislation and how that legislation unfolded and formed the foundation for where we are today. And it's important to talk about the legislation in relation to service delivery, because the services that we deliver today are based upon the legislation that's evolved over the years. I'm going to start with the early years, the very first legislation that relates to adult services or rehabilitation. And as I go through the legislation, there'll be a couple of points, a couple of times when I stop and I talk about some of the programs that exist as a result of that legislation. But by and large, I'm going to be talking about the continuum from the early legislation up until the early 1970s. And it'll be only in part two that we really, to any extent, talk about the service delivery mechanisms that are in place. But part two will build upon part one. So the legislation lays the foundation for the services. And we will back into the models of service delivery by looking at how the legislation first unfolded. It'll be a gradual unlocking, looking at the early legislation, how it evolved, and that will lead eventually into the various service models. So, we call it rehabilitation legislation. It's really adult services. And the services began with the state workers' compensation laws in New York in 1910, and it was followed by the National Defense Act in 1916 to reintegrate soldiers. These were our first laws. They formed the framework, first dealing with worker rights, and then reintegrating returning soldiers. Next was the Smith-Hughes Act of 1917. And this established an interesting principle. The principle was that the federal government and the states would have a matching partnership in providing funding for services. And this matching funding evolved through the Smith-Hughes Act. It was a vocational education program, and it formed a federal board for vocational education. Its focus was on returning World War I wounded veterans. Next, we move to the 1918 Smith-Sears Vocational Rehabilitation Act. Notice the term vocational rehabilitation appearing in the act. It really was formed for all veterans with a disability. It had job training and education, and it was under the Federal Board for Vocational Rehabilitation. It was the Soldiers Rehabilitation Act. Next comes the 1920 Smith-Fess Act. And in many ways, it formed the first foundation for our present system. It did so because it included vocational guidance, it included vocational education, it included occupational adjustment, and even placement services. And rather than being an act for returning soldiers, this was an act for the civilian vocational population. And it continued with the state-federal partnership of providing half of the funding this time from the federal government and half from the state. So this takes us to the 1921 Veterans Bureau and how it was formed. And of course, its intention is to provide services for veterans, and it later evolved into becoming the VA at the cabinet level. Now today we have a number of major hospitals that provide service on site. We have the Hines VA Hospital in Chicago. We have the Eastern Blind Hospital at West Haven. We have the Southeastern Blind in Birmingham, Alabama. We have the Southwestern Blind in Tucson, Arizona. We have the Western Blind in Palo Alto, California. And there are a couple of others as well. There are also clinics that serve individuals who don't go to a center at a hospital, but are served in their own community. We have something called the VIST programs, which stands for Visual Impairment Service Team, and there are just bordering around 100, a little less than 100 of those teams across the country, and they serve people in their communities. We also have the BROS, which is called the Blind Rehabilitation Outreach Specialists, and again, they serve within the community and do coordination of services. That's a smaller number there within the teens. This brings us to 1933. The vocational rehab program was placed in the Office of Education. And vocational rehab moved around quite a bit, as you'll see as we go through these slides. But in 1933, it was placed in the Office of Education. (1935) brings us the landmark act, the Social Security Act. This was really breakthrough legislation. It established vocational rehabilitation as a permanent program. And some of the features of it at that point in time, it established something called Title 10, which was Aid to the Blind, abbreviated AB. Also, it had a title for Aid for the Disabled called AFD. Also, Aid for the Aged, AFA. And they constituted what was sometimes often called welfare. But in 1974, the programs were shifted to Social Security, and they were under SSI. 1936 saw the development of the Randolph-Shepard Act, and that's basically vending stands on federal property. And they began with portable stands in New York, and it was Randolph and Shepard that introduced bills into Congress to create permanent stands. And so the vending facility program, authorized by the Randolph-Shepard Act, provides persons who are blind with remunerative employment and self-support through the operation of vending facilities on federal and other property. The program, enacted into law in 1936, was intended to enhance employment opportunities for trained, licensed blind persons to operate facilities. The law was subsequently amended in 1954 and then again in 1974 to ultimately ensure individuals who are blind a priority in the operation of vending facilities, which included cafeterias, snack bars, automatic vending machines, all of those things initially on federal property. So the current status of the program, let me give you some statistics on the Randolph-Shepard program. 2/3 of the vendors are on state properties these days, and 1/3 are on federal properties. They administer cafeterias that have prepared foods, including hot meals. They have snack bars that have different lines of refreshment and some prepared foods. And then, of course, vending machines that are really automated dispensers. In 1938, we had the Wagner-O'Day Act. And this act evolved throughout the years and has had a major impact on employment of visually impaired and severely impaired individuals. It started as workshops to employ blind people through the National Industries of the Blind. Later, there was an extension to other disabilities through an amendment by Javits, and that established the National Industries for the Severely Handicapped, or NISH, N-I-S-H. This was all administered under a committee for the purchase from blind and other severely handicapped that coordinated the program. And it originally allowed sub-minimum wages to be paid to the workers depending upon the amount of output, work output, that they were able to generate. But today, as we'll talk about a little later, minimum wage is paid pretty much universally in these programs. So, as I mentioned, the purchase of designated products from these workshops started with National Industries for the Blind, extended to other individuals, to individuals with other disabilities, major role from National Industries for the Severely Handicapped, and the Committee for Purchase from the Blind and Other Severely Handicapped ran the operation. And sub-minimum wages were commensurate with productivity. Today, this program exists, and it's called the Ability One program. The Ability One program uses the purchasing power of the federal government to buy products and services from participating community-based nonprofit agencies located nationwide, dedicated to training and employing individuals with disabilities. Through the Ability One program, people with disabilities enjoy full participation in their community, and they can market their Ability One learned skills into other public and private sector jobs. The Ability One program is the largest source of employment for people who are blind or have significant disabilities in the United States. More than 550 nonprofit organizations employ these individuals and provide quality products and services to the federal government at a fair market price. The program is administered by the Commission, and the Commission is an independent federal agency with assistance from the National Industries for the Blind and NISH, as we mentioned before. However, NISH has changed its name as of 2013 and is now called Sorts America. So the two components are National Industries for the Blind, having to do with blind individuals, of course, and Sorts America for all other disabilities. The Ability One program has sales and services and provides them to the federal government, and they're valued at more than $2 billion a year. While the Ability One program continues to grow regularly, the sales to the federal government account for less than 1% of all federal procurement dollars spent. In July of 2000, the federal government withdrew support from the Javits-Wagner-O'Day Act to some extent. The rules were changed so that employment at these facility-based agencies would no longer be counted as a successful rehabilitation outcome. Rehabilitation counselors who administer the vocational rehabilitation program in the past would receive credit for individuals who were placed in these facilities. But as of July 2000, that ended, and they considered these facilities to be sheltered employment and only as transitional placements. And so this means that vocational rehabilitation money cannot be spent on training for individuals in these facilities because they're not considered competitive employment in integrated settings, and that is what the government wants to foster. And so funding for these programs doesn't come out of the federal government. They have to be self-sufficient at this point in time. Let's move on to the 1940s. And in 1943, we saw the Bardeen-La Follette Act. And this was called the Magna Carta for the Blind. And that's because it greatly expanded services. It was really a primary program for blind individuals. It also extended services to mentally ill, and it increased the scope of vocational rehabilitation in general. It extended services also to those who are cognitively challenged or mentally retarded, as the term was used at that point in time. And the Rehabilitation Office of Vocational Rehabilitation, was established for the first time at that point. And also there was a continuation of the matching program, which was between the state and the federal government, continuing at a 50-50 split. Just a few words about Mary Switzer, who expanded services greatly. She was very supportive of services in the area of blind rehabilitation, and really in many ways by offering grants helped many of the universities get started. Between 1950 and 1969, she was the Office of Vocational Rehabilitation Administrator and worked greatly to expand the budget and the services. It went from $20 million to $500 million during that time frame. In 1954, we saw the Vocational Rehabilitation Act amendments. And those amendments provided research and demonstration grants. Many of the grants went to colleges and universities to prepare professional rehabilitation workers. And so it laid the foundation for our universities of today in many ways, although those grants went primarily for vocational counselors rather than the specialists that we work with. Funds for vocational evaluation and work adjustment were also made possible as a result of this program. It increased the emphasis on cognitively impaired, and it also increased the federal share in the matching program to 60%. Along comes 1963, and the Office of Vocational Rehab, OVR, became the Vocational Rehabilitation Administration, the VRA, and it went to HEW. So again, a lot of movement for that office. In 1965, we had the Vocational Rehabilitation Act amendments. Those amendments expanded services to juvenile and public offenders, alcohol or drug abusers, and the socially disadvantaged. Eventually, the socially disadvantaged were removed from that category. The federal match went up to a 75-25 split, and the amendments allowed evaluations of individuals for up to 18 months while determining whether they were really eligible for full services. It also provided follow-up services for family members. We had further amendments in 1967, and there was funding that was established for the National Center for Deafblind Youth and Adults. And today, of course, we have the Helen Keller National Deafblind Center. There were also pilot projects for services for migratory agricultural workers. 1968 vocational rehab amendments. All of these amendments adding to the Act itself. At this point in time, for the first time, the split went above 75% and went to an 80% federal state funding formula.